takes off based on recording in progress. All right, takes off based on Phil's recent book, Information at War, and it came out before Russia invaded Ukraine, but it really speaks to the issues that we see today. And Phil just recently retired from the University of Southern California, where he's there for 40 years. I mean, what a career! But Phil really has written so many books, including on Edward R. Murrow himself. And he and I have worked on a few projects trying to on public diplomacy and on Murrow. And he has constantly come back to this subject of covering wars and information at war and so forth. And at USC, he ran the Center for Public Diplomacy there, and also was a vice dean and many other positions at USC. So he has been one of the great thinkers in all these issues. And then we have Thom Shanker with us, who's going to moderate and lead Phil, and he's going to contribute to this discussion. Thom is on the board of the Edward R. Murrow Center. He's a Fletcher graduate. Thom just recently retired from the New York Times, where he's a national security editor. And Thom has written books himself written a book himself about the war. He's been a war correspondent in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and has been on the front lines of just these sorts of situations that we're seeing today in Ukraine, and been responsible for the coverage of just these kinds of situations that we're seeing. And he's a real thinker and someone who has been very hands-on on all these kinds of issues. And Thom just has been very closely involved with the Murrow Center over the years, and so we're so happy to have him handling this. So I think, Thom, I will turn it over to you, and we're off and running.
Thank you so much, Edward. It's a great honor to be back with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, even in this virtual format. So Edward, thank you for organizing this, and to the Murrow Center for hosting us. And it's true, I've spent much of my adult life in conflict zones and combat zones. And one thing I'll tell you is that when you go off to cover a war, the war covers you, and you're never the same again. So it's great to be able to have this discussion with an esteemed thinker like Philip, and seeing the quality of the people here. I hope to make this a discussion and not just a moderated Q&A with Philip. I have some themes I'd like to explore for the first 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we will invite all of you participating to ask questions and to comment. So Philip, thank you for your time today and sharing your wisdom. And I want to really start up here at the 30,000 foot level and get your assessment of the coverage of Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. What has been some of the strong parts of the coverage? And if there were weaknesses that you would like to see corrected, what would those be?
Well, I think overall, first off, thank you, and thanks to Fletcher for having me here and for organizing this discussion. I think overall the coverage of the Ukraine war has been substantive and lets people know what they basically need to know. There is a flood of information, and this reflects in part the continuing evolution of war reporting and the continuing evolution of journalism in a greater sense. There is sensationalism. I have a few caveats here. There is sensationalism, which is really unavoidable in war coverage. There is a lot of tugging at heartstrings, which is part of war. What happens to civilians? What happens to children? What happens to entire cities? That is an important part of the story, but it should not obscure the more complex parts. Complexity defies particularly television, news, and social media. It's just as if you were covering crime as a sensational spot news issue rather than a societal issue. I think one of the other things that we can talk about that news organizations over the long haul should pay attention to is the coverage of civilian lives in this war compared to what is going on elsewhere in the world. There have been a couple of incidents already involving journalists with comments about these are people like us. This is Europe after all. And one of the things that characterizes just about every or most Ukrainians is that they're white. And if you want to find genocide, go to Burma and look at that war. Go to Yemen and look at the plight of the refugees there. There are plenty of other wars. Go to South Sudan. Plenty of wars where the people don't look like us and don't get covered as well. So, when we step back and look at not just the day-to-day coverage, but sort of the grand scheme of news coverage, I would hope that news organizations, Western news organizations, American news organizations would engage in some introspection about how they cover the plight of people who are victimized by war around the world. And again, I would say that for the most part, the coverage of Ukraine has been good, but there's always time, there's always an opportunity, always a need to evaluate the approach that journalists take to covering war.
Thank you. And you set up my second question perfectly, Philip, which goes to the coverage of the destruction of cities in Ukraine. Mariupol, first and foremost, and just in recent days, we've seen Putin promote the general who oversaw Russian intervention in Syria to support another dictator, Assad, which I think will show those Syrian techniques coming into play here. But my question, Philip, is Putin's done this before. He leveled Grozny in the Second Chechen War. He leveled Aleppo to support a dictator, Assad, and no sanctions. There was some moral outrage. This has been mentioned in reporting, but I have yet to see a story that highlights that. And I wonder if this also goes to your point that as long as Putin's killing Muslims, it's okay.
Well, I think that's part of it. And I also think things are changing a bit now because of advances in what can be called forensic journalism. I'm a big fan of Bellingcat, which uses crowdsourcing and satellite imagery to investigate stories on the ground that really were out of reach before. This is sort of a growth of the citizen journalism we saw developing in places like Raqqa, Syria, and elsewhere during that war. If there are any aspiring journalists in our audience, I strongly suggest that you read We Are Bellingcat by Elliot Higgins, who's the founder of Bellingcat. It's fascinating how they use crowdsourced information, they use satellite imagery, and that cuts off Putin's escape by saying, well, all these dead bodies in Bucha, they were obviously done by the Ukrainians themselves. Well, that satellite imagery and the reporting that's come out of that has shown that those bodies were there when the Russians were there. And so it's not that the Russians left and then Ukrainians came in and murdered their own countrymen, which is what Putin would have us believe. We now have hard evidence that that is not the case. And that's the sort of thing that journalists really need. It's the great strength of journalism, is that kind of hard evidence. So I suspect that it's going to be harder for people to do this kind of mass killing as the Russians are now. Now, what you do about it, the idea of trying Putin for war crimes, well, maybe you can do that in absentia, but there's no way you're going to touch him. So it really becomes a matter of reaching out to publics around the world and telling them the truth of what's going on and underscoring the truthfulness of that by showcasing these new journalistic skills.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So that's in the world of real information, real news, not fake news. I'd like to pivot to disinformation and fake news, Philip, and get your sense about how disinformation has been used by the Russians, when it was effective and when not. And I'm not at all going down the road of moral equivalency here, but the Ukrainians too have put out some reports that have proven over time not to be true. So give us your judgment of disinformation by both sides in this war.
Well, I think it's important in any war, you're going to have misinformation, which is information that's wrong without necessarily any attempt to deceive people. Then you have disinformation, which is purposefully wrong, which is meant to deceive people. And the key thing about disinformation is it cannot be allowed to go unanswered. There has to be direct response to contradict what's going on. Now, the interesting thing is the Russians had considered themselves, particularly after their interference in the American 2016 presidential campaign, to be the masters of disinformation. It hasn't worked as well this time, in part because there is such a large volume of counter information that is available. You just take a look at Twitter, for example, and all the Ukrainians who are on Twitter. They're members of parliament. They're members of NGOs. There's so many people. The voice is so loud. It goes back to that old US Supreme Court dicta that to deal with speech that you don't like, provide more speech. Well, now, if you hear voices you don't like, talk louder than them, provide more voices. Now, the one thing that is worth paying attention to that I think has not gotten enough attention from the news media is the fact that Russia has benefited considerably from secondary voices, particularly the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese are really the masters at influencing the global information flow. And so it is, I think that deserves more attention, because over the long run, particularly from American standpoint, China is going to be a bigger factor than Russia. Also, we get into the whole issue of citizens' responsibility, taking care of themselves. That's where media literacy comes in. People need to be wary. They need to be skeptical. They need to check alternative sources. And perhaps the Ukraine war will raise alertness about this. Again, it's important when we talk about lessons from this war, from any war, to realize that this process is not static. The next war, and I'm afraid there will be a next war, who knows where it will be, but there will be a next war, and the media response to that, both in terms of journalism and just technology, will be different. And so it's a question for people who are aspiring diplomats, aspiring journalists, policymakers of all sorts from all countries, to pay attention to the way the world gets its information about armed conflict.
I'd like to draw you out a little more on the media literacy. I know you and I have spoken this before. Edward is very much a champion of this. You know, you gave just a couple of things. Some countries in Scandinavia actually have courses on media literacy. So Philip, expand a little bit. Give us your 5 commandments or 10 commandments on what every citizen should do, and really give us some, like, fingertip tips, because it's so important right now.
Okay. Well, I think media literacy really is a systemic issue. And the country that does it best by far is Finland. And Finland starts media literacy training in kindergarten and runs it all the way through the 12th grade. And then an additional, they integrate media literacy issues into the teaching of everything from civics to mathematics. And so that's important itself. They also offer, the government offers media literacy training to adults and others who are not in school. So in fact, there was a spokesperson for the Prime Minister's office there who a year or two ago said, kindergarten is our first line of defense in dealing with media literacy. I don't think it has been taken seriously enough by the education establishment or the journalistic establishment, for that matter, in the United States. I see that the New York Times a few months ago designated one of their people to be the information reporter. I can't remember his name right now, but he was an editorial writer, I believe. And so that becomes very important. There are any number of universities and NGOs that are working on media literacy, but what we need are some major countries that enjoy the benefits of a very vital media environment to say, okay, we're going to do this now. We're going to make sure our public schools teach young people, and of course, young people as young as kindergarten are using the internet already, teach them how to be skeptical, how to challenge, how to research, how to get truth, not just get news. News and truth are not always the same thing.
You know, under Edward's watch, our Edward R. Murrow Center has even added "In a Digital World" to its title, which is such a smart thing to have done. So I wanted to talk about that. Those of us who covered Ronald Reagan at, in Berlin saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall," would like to see Joe Biden show up at Google or Microsoft and say, "Mr. Putin, tear down that digital wall." And it's something that we're working on a lot in my project here. How can we help Russians get more real news? There are small, computer literate people who have VPNs. There are those who still go on websites. But when someone like a Putin basically controls the internet, or a country like China, how can we in the West that believe in information, First Amendment, what can we do to help these societies have access to information?
Well, I'll give you an example of that. Over the years, I have been critical in writing in a number of forums of the US government's attempts at public diplomacy and information dissemination. But I must say, during this Ukraine war, the US Agency for Global Media, which includes Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and numerous other outlets, has been outstanding. They have been very aggressive. Radio Free Europe has 150 people in Ukraine, and they have I don't know if they're publicizing this, but they're calling it Ring Around Russia, and they are enhancing their broadcasting and their various kinds of communication into not just Russia, but also Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, places like that, and they are trying to counter the Russian influence in places like Africa and Latin America. In between the Russians and the Chinese, both countries, but particularly the Chinese, I think, have plans for reaching global audiences. And if you don't want the Chinese or the Russians just to run rampant with their version of events through their information sources, their information providers, it's incumbent on countries such as the United States to push back. And I think that's, I had a long conversation a few days ago with somebody at the US Agency for Global Media, and I was really impressed by how aggressive they're being. And I think that as media becomes more important, more ubiquitous, that has to be done. And I think there are now between 3 and 4 billion people in the world who have smartphones. And so this is the new generation of information. We talked about Ed Murrow and what a pioneer he was just using radio. Well, we've gone from radio to television to social media, and who knows where we're going next. But it's, I think particularly for any students who are in our audience here today, if you're looking at a future in diplomacy or in news or in any other of these related fields, the world keeps opening wider and wider to you. The technology keeps growing more sophisticated, and the ability to reach people is incredible. I mean, it's the idea that you have 4 or 5 million people with cell phones in their billion people rather with cell phones in their hands, able to get information instantly, changes the way one does foreign policy, changes the way one does journalism, and changes the way just about everybody lives.
Yeah, I mean, to prove that point, the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman 2 weekends ago said that this was the war in Ukraine was really the first world war, not because of the geographic battle space, but because of the information space. The people worldwide have instantaneous access to what's going on in Ukraine. Philip, I wanted to get your thoughts on something I've wrestled with, which is, in the battle of public narratives, I mentioned moral equivalency earlier, and just because the victim does things, that the aggressor has also done doesn't make them equally bad. Putin has scored quite a few PR points being criticized for his war of choice in Ukraine because he points to the Washington, D.C. and says, what about Iraq? Your invasion of Iraq was a war of choice. Your bombing of Serbia, a Slavic fellow nation, well, what was a war of choice? How should that be answered by the Western democracies?
Well, I think the Western democracies have to, have to admit the fact that not everything that they do is correct. Not everything that they do is righteous. And, if you want to make a case against the US war in Iraq, that's not too difficult a case for anybody to make, whether you're American or Russian, and certainly if you're Iraqi, it's a pretty easy case to make. So I think any sort of self-justification, such as we hear from Putin, is kind of beside the point when you show what he has done and continues to do to the people and cities of Ukraine. It's just a cop-out to say, well, you've fought wars too. Everybody in the world just about has fought wars. That doesn't make it right. And so the pressure has to be kept on Putin. He can't be allowed to slither out of this in that way.
Thank you very much. I have just one more question really before I turn this over, not just to participant questions, but to participant comments. I see a really august gathering here today. And my question is about Edward R. Murrow. You wrote a fabulous book on Murrow, and I was honored to have organized a conference with the Murrow Center a few years ago talking about democracy in the digital age. What would Edward R. Murrow do? So I'd like to pose that question to you today. If Edward R. Murrow was Edward R. Murrow covering the war in Ukraine, what would he be doing that we can learn from?
Well, I think he'd be either in Kyiv or Mariupol, smoking too many cigarettes, as he was wont to do. But he would be making clear just, well, let me put it this way. One of the great strengths of Murrow's reporting was his ability to transcend the politics and the governmental aspects of what was going on during the Blitz in London in 1940, and form a kind of kinship between the American audience, which at that time, of course, was very isolationist, many of the people there, and the people in the UK. And I think that was, in London in particular, I think that Murrow understood better than most journalists the connection between the individual victim of war and the policies of war. He never lost sight of the fact that while he was doing stories about individual victims in London of the German bombing, that the United States government and the American people had a responsibility to respond to that. That was the message that he was pushing quite forcefully. And as it turned out, after Franklin Roosevelt won his re-election in 1940, he became more aggressive in providing assistance to the Brits before the U.S. entered the war at the end of 1941. So I think Murrow would be doing pretty much the same thing today that he was doing in London in 1940, merging the human and the policy aspects of war, and urging his publics to take seriously what was going on. There was a tribute dinner to Murrow in New York just a couple weeks before Pearl Harbor, and Archibald MacLeish, the famous American man of letters, said in his speech introducing Murrow, "You burned the city of London in our homes, and we felt the flames." And that is, I think, what Murrow would be doing today. And there's no reason it has to be Murrow. I mean, there are plenty of young women and men who are correspondents who are out there doing this work. And I would hope that they would be able to look back and say, our audience in the United States, or our audience wherever it was able to feel the flames and feel and imagine the rubble that they're seeing in Ukraine.
Well, and to be sure, our brothers and sisters in the press corps on the ground in Ukraine today are doing absolutely fantastic work.
Yeah.
So at this point, I'd love to invite audience questions, comments. Stephanie, did you want to call on people? How should we proceed here?
If people want to put their questions in the chat or raise their hand, I can call on them.
I see one from Peter.
Peter.
Yeah, hi, everybody, and Tom and Phil, thanks so much for this presentation. Absolutely fascinating. In terms of disinformation in the next few months and then in the next few years, what can we expect from Russia in the U.S. and specifically in the campaigns and in U.S. politics? We've they've been active, we know, intervened very actively, and what could we see going forward? And in relation to that as well, can the U.S. and should the U.S. do anything in the opposite direction? That is, projecting and broadcasting information to Russia, and how much can it get done?
Well, my response would key on that last part, and I think that's what the agency for global media, U.S. Agency for Global Media, is trying to do. They're even using shortwave because they know that there are some people in Russia who still have shortwave sets, and they're by using VPNs and various social media methods of getting around the virtual Iron Curtain that the Putin government has created. I think we are getting messaging. The United States is getting messaging into Russia. Obviously not as fully as American policymakers would like, but still getting through. In terms of what Putin's going to do next, well, I suspect while he's dealing with Ukraine, he also has people working on the French election and getting information in there, trying to subvert their process as well. And if his pal Donald Trump decides to run again in 2024, I think we'll see some intervention efforts on their behalf again. It's impossible to really stop it. And that's why media literacy is so important. The public has to take a certain amount of responsibility, a large amount of responsibility for itself. And that's why media literacy is really the key to stopping or at least limiting the damage that, excuse me, that disinformation can do. And just looking at the newspaper yesterday and thinking about ways that other countries can interfere with American politics, Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia just gave $2 billion to Jared Kushner, and how much of that is going to float into the 2024 U.S. presidential campaign, either as information, messaging, or who knows what sort of efforts are going to be made. I think that because information messaging is so easy to do, and it's so accessible. I mean, you can sit there and you look like you have a nice beach in back of you, but you can type out disinformation and reach with retweets and things like that, reach huge audiences, never leaving your beachfront. And it's that is something, again, that I think the public needs to be more aware of. There used to be kind of a joke, well, if it's on the internet, it must be true. I'm afraid there are too many people who took that seriously. So folks have to understand, you want to use the internet, learn what bad things it can do as well as what benefits it can provide.
Peter, if I could just hop onto that, my family knows what I call the airline oxygen mask rule. You know how when you get on the safety tips, it's like, in case of oxygen, affix your own oxygen mask first and then help others. And so I say that if we want to defend democracy in Ukraine, the most important thing we can do is secure democracy here in the United States ahead of our elections.
Absolutely.
Yep. Thank you.
Questions or comments from others? We invite you to speak.
I have a question, Tom and Phil. Going back to that issue of the moral equivalence between the United States and Russia, when you look at American invasion of Iraq and American action to Afghanistan and so forth, is there a difference in the intentions between what the Americans were doing, what the U.S. was doing, and what Putin is doing in Russia today? Is there something that says this is different? Do people in Africa and Latin America and the rest of the world perceive it that way or not?
Well, of course, the Russians try to keep this idea of moral equivalence alive as much as possible. Obviously, at least obviously to me, the real equivalence with Putin is not with the United States, but is with Adolf Hitler. And you can see very distinct parallels between Czechoslovakia in 1938 and Ukraine right now. I mean, and just the idea that Putin says, well, give me Ukraine and then my hunger will be satisfied. Well, that's obviously false. He's obviously eyeing certainly Georgia and Moldova and presumably Lithuania and others. He's the man who said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And so I think Putin is in a class by himself. And the idea that he can try to draw clear lines between what he's doing in Ukraine and what the US had done elsewhere, I think falls apart pretty quickly. That's not to say that, again, that everything that the US has done over the years is morally or politically appropriate, but Putin shouldn't be allowed any escape hatches like that.
Professor Hendrickson, sir, I see your hand is up.
Yes, it is actually, Philip, what you were just saying about the parallel between what's happening in Ukraine and what happened in 1938 in Czechoslovakia was what I had in mind as well. I have observed, maybe wrongly, that the journalists covering the Ukraine war are not making historical and comparative references like that, even ones that many readers would have in mind. And I wonder why, whether that might be considered a distraction. I mean, I think not only of what happened in 1938 in Czechoslovakia, but say the bombing of Guernica, during the Spanish Civil War, where there are certain resemblances with the present. And you mentioned earlier Edward R. Murrow and his radio broadcast. Actually, the first real-time transatlantic radio broadcasts were by CBS during the Anschluss crisis, with H.V. Kaltenborn being the anchorman in New York. And that brought the European war home, into people's houses. They were listening to the radio at that time. In fact, at the time of the Czechoslovakian crisis, there was that famous situation where Orson Welles had a radio program about War in the Worlds based on H.G. Wells, and people thought the Germans had landed, that the Martians were really Germans, in disguise. And my question is, should the journalists covering the Iraq War, the Ukraine War, while being not sensational, should they be trying to create some sense of danger, some sense of alarm in the United States itself? I mean, Tom Friedman called it World War III, the first World War in the information space. There doesn't seem to be much sense in the United States now of danger, even though there are references to the possible use of tactical or other nuclear weapons and chemical and biological weapons. And in 1938, people were afraid of what was coming. And I'm not certain they are now. And should journalists consciously deal with that question? That is, to what degree and how, if they really believe it, there is danger for everyone.
Well, I think there's some very important points there. You know, Friedman in his column a few days ago called it World War Wired, and that I think acknowledges the importance of the new communication technologies. One of the reasons, I'm sorry to say, that I think many journalists do not make the connection between what Putin is doing and what Hitler did is they don't know.
Yeah.
After teaching journalism classes for many years, I was always distressed that there was much more effort in many more courses about the mechanics of the news and the vocational aspects of doing journalism than there were in the historical and what we might call more intellectual aspects. I pretty much gave up. I lost that battle, which I fought for years. But I think that putting events in context is always difficult, but always an essential part of what journalists are supposed to do. Just providing, okay, here's what happened today in Kyiv, here's what happened yesterday in Mariupol, and so on and so forth. That's not enough. There is an educational function that journalism should fulfill, as well as just delivering this sort of the series of bulletins. And I think just about every news organization could do a better job of that.
If I could offer just a small explanation, if not defense of a profession where I spent 40 years of my life, clearly, Professor, you're right, history is important. I bemoan the fact that the history of Grozny and Aleppo, which is far more recent than World War II, is not really captured correctly. But I will say that working journalists are very reluctant to ever use the Nazi analogy. That's the break glass in case of emergency. And because journalists see that thrown around willy-nilly in superficial ways in domestic arguments at home, in the political fights in a local congressional district, that even though, of course, your analogy to Czechoslovakia is completely correct, I think journalists are loath to go to Hitler, Putin, Nazis, Russia, for fear of undermining the debate. So how they strike that balance, that's the big question.
Right. But it needs to be struck. That balance needs to be underscored. And I think Americans in particular are a little lackadaisical about how they analyze what's going on in the world in terms of how threatening it might be to this country. And journalists have to try to rectify that. And if you make people worry, they need to be worried. Here you've got a nuclear power in Russia that is running rampant over a smaller country, and people don't see the connection, the threat that poses to the United States. And you can go back to the late 1930s again and look at the isolationism of in the United States. People refused to recognize the threat that Hitler was creating, and until it was really too late to stop him. He could have been stopped early on in the mid 1930s, but nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wants to really challenge the Russians, and yet at the same time, I say don't want to challenge the Russians. The public isn't so much thinking about how to effectively challenge. I would argue that what NATO and the United States are doing is just one step short of going to war with Russia, and we don't want to see that step taken. But at the same time, the response has really been pretty robust. I saw the other day a document from the State Department that said that the U.S. had already provided 50 million rounds of ammunition Ukraine. Plus, you've got all these other NATO countries that are providing assistance. So it's there's some good things there too in terms of the awakening of the West and the fact that you have Finland, which, and as well as Sweden, but Finland, which had been so forcefully against joining NATO for so many years because they saw it as being unduly provocative of the Soviet Union or Russia. They're now talking very seriously about joining NATO. So it's, you know, the world is in flux, and it's going to affect the United States for the foreseeable future. And if we don't get information about that from the news media, where are we going to get it?
And I guess just to show my bias, it's too bad that every reporter on the ground in Ukraine didn't have a chance to take Alan Hendrickson's diplomatic history class.
So, do we have any sense of who's winning the information war in Africa and in Latin America, Southeast Asia? Do we have a feel for that? Given this is about information at war, what's happening in those parts of the world?
Well, I thought it was interesting that when there was a UN vote a couple of weeks ago condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that very few countries voted against it, but a lot of countries, or not a lot, but a number of countries abstained, and many of those countries were African. And I think the policymakers at the U.S. State Department, particularly with regard to media outreach, are very conscious of the Russian, and for that matter, the Chinese messaging that's reaching both Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, and they're pushing hard back on that. I mentioned the ring around Russia before, but also there are particular efforts being directed at Africa and Latin America to offset the Russian and Chinese messaging, which is trying to justify the war in Ukraine.
Other questions, thoughts, comments?
So I'm filled with questions. So so I'll just. But to Phil, I thought it was very interesting when you mentioned about Radio Free Europe. You know, there's a big debate that maybe, you know, Voice of America and all those other regional radios, media, U.S. government media outlets are passe, right? And we have CNN being international. We've got BBC, and we have so many other things that are, you know, Western media being international and easily accessible in so many parts of the world. Does something here tell us that yes, there is a role for the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and we really do want to keep funding that and doing that?
Oh, I think so. I think it needs. I'm glad that that the U.S. Agency for Global Media has been rejuvenated after it was almost destroyed during the Trump administration. There has to be a way for governments to get their messages out. You know, this is part of public diplomacy, and it's really one of the essential elements of public diplomacy. And so I think to just say, well, people could watch CNN, or they could watch Fox News, or they could watch, you know, PBS, whatever, or they could watch the BBC or France 24 and so on, Deutsche Welle. The government needs to be able to use mass media, and it has the difficult path to follow of keeping their content journalistically honest, but still serving the national interest. I mean, that's what it's all about for these government operations. Is, I mean, you advance the U.S. national interest, or if you're Deutsche Welle, you advance the German national interest. And there are some communication purists who would say government should not be involved at all. I disagree with that. I think that's an example of terrible naivete. The world does not allow governments to drop out of the communication business and let others, let private enterprise do it. I think there's no question that if you look at the content on the U.S. government channels and compare it to CNN, the goals, the political goal of the U.S. government media, again, it might irritate journalistic purists, but in terms of doing diplomacy and in terms of advancing the national interest, I don't see how you do without it.
Thom, what do you think? I mean, you were over there at the New York Times. I mean, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, The Economist now have a huge international audience, right? It appeals to, an elite around the world. What do you think? Is there?
Well, it's interesting. I spent 5 years in Moscow up through the collapse of communism. And, my wife and I used to string 40 feet of wire over our living rooms. We could get the BBC despite the jamming and VOA and the jazz on Radio Free Europe. So I definitely appreciate the value of government-sponsored media to reach those audiences. And all of my friends, the underground rockers in Leningrad, used to love American jazz and rock and roll that they heard through these. I do think there should be a separation between the government-sponsored media and what we do in the independent press. And the problem is, in the global world, there's no separation. Once it's out there on the internet, the government message gets muddled with the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post. And I think the separation is important, and our mission is completely different. International news organizations are going to those markets to spread quality news. I think New York Times publisher once said, the paper was debating going from print to online, how to do it. And he said, I would beam New York Times quality news to people's cerebral cortex if we could figure out how to do it. So the platform is less important. It's getting quality news out there, but I can't stress enough that there has to be a divide in the minds of people between the important work that the government has the right to do and that of the independent media.
By the way, I see that Casey Murrow is in our audience, as is Ambassador Bill Rue. So we've got some very distinguished people here. Thank you guys for joining us. Ambassador Rue might have something, Bill.
Yeah, Bill, feel free to weigh in on this debate. You're muted, Bill. You're muted. We don't hear you.
Okay, thank you
There
for
he
this
is.
discussion. And I agree 100% with Phil's comment that the U.S. Agency for Global Media should continue and be strengthened if possible. If nothing else, then it explains American policy, and it conveys the devastation that the Russians have inflicted on the Ukraine. And that's essential. But we have to be realistic and understand that there are limits to that power, if you will. I mean, I think it should continue and be strengthened, and we ought to do all the broadcasting we can, particularly in this crisis situation. But for example, you mentioned Africa, the Middle Eastern nations, including Israel, and some of the Arab states that we have close relations with, have not complied fully with our request to punish Russia. And I'm sure that American diplomats are working hard on that, and they need support from organs like U.S. broadcasting media. But they have their own reasons for stalling or resisting American requests to punish Russia. They want to basically hedge their bets, and they want to maintain relations with Russia even after the crisis is over, no matter who's in power. And that's a sentiment and a policy we should understand. We can't force them to cancel relations with Russia because they'll lose source of weapons, they'll lose source of food, of wheat, and so on. and they've made their own decision, despite what they know we're trying to get them to do. And we can continue to broadcast to their public and show the benefits of American policy and the destruction that Russia is rendering on the Ukraine. And that helps maybe persuade the leadership in Israel and Saudi Arabia and the other Arab countries to maybe modify their position. And it shows that, and they've shown that they're a little bit wavering as well. The UAE in particular has voted one way and another way on punishing Russia. So, you know, they're not hard and fast committed to a policy we don't like. And I think the broadcasting will help move them in the right direction. That's my comment.
Thank you, Bill. It's good to see you, even virtually.
I
Thank
know
you.
Stephanie has curated a couple questions from the audience. Stephanie, can you help us out with those, please?
Yes, for sure. Some audience members wonder if you can speak to building capacity in media literacy for teachers who have the intention to incorporate it into their teaching, but have no professional expertise. So we're wondering if you could speak to some of that and maybe share some resources too.
Okay. Well, there are, I think if you go on to Google media literacy, you will find that there are some nonprofit organizations that actually design curricula for elementary school on up in terms of training in media literacy. And I've had some dealings with several of them, and they're very impressive, very smart people working very hard to make media literacy. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they should get rid of algebra and put media literacy in its place. But that they're working very hard on that. And I think you can find, I don't have the specific groups in mind right now, but it's you can find them online very, very easily.
You know, a little footnote to add to that. We are in fact working with the BBC on doing media literacy for Gen Z in about 50 countries. And so they have an effort on that. And so we're trying to see how we can work together to help foster just what you're saying, Phil.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? We have about 5 minutes left. The floor is open.
Well, Tom, I wanted to say thank you so much to both of you for doing this program, and to Edward as well. This is an absolutely impressive presentation, and I know it's being recorded. I hope that it'll be disseminated in a variety of ways.
It will totally.
Good.
And see, as a member of the Murrow board, just thank you for your support and encouragement. It means so much to all of us. Thank you.
So I wonder if I might come back to the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and Alan may want to weigh in on this one too. The Trump administration actually tried to take all the various, Voice America and all the other little channels, and kind of make it an extension of the White House press office. And instead of trying to cover the news with some sort of objectivity and honesty and independence. And so when it was, when the Voice of America was really set up, it really was designed to reflect American media values and American media independence. Of course, it had an American point of view, and it was part of the U.S. government. But there's always this big tension about how independent it should or shouldn't be from State Department and U.S. policy. What do you think of it? What are the lessons that we have of what the Trump administration was trying to do, and now what we see happening in the information war over Ukraine, and everything you say about what I thought was fascinating about Radio Free Europe?
Well, at the very beginning of Voice of America, I believe it was broadcasting in German in the early 1940s during the war. It said, "We're going to tell you the truth," and I think that's whether it's good or bad. And I think that premise has to hold, and or else these government media are going to lose their credibility. But at the same time, the agenda has to be the agenda of these news organizations, and that's what they are, has to reflect the policy goals of the United States. I mean, they are part of the government. That it's a very difficult balance to strike sometime. Some presidencies, some administrations are more tolerant than others of how much independence and how much criticism can be leveled by government media agencies. Some administrations have no tolerance whatsoever, and that obstructs the work of these media organizations and severely damages their credibility. So I think a fidelity, a faithfulness to truth is really the essence of those organizations, as it is or should be for all news organizations. I mean, the state of the news business, in what might have been a fit of masochism, I watched all of Tucker Carlson the other night for a whole hour, and I was astonished. This is not journalism. This is something altogether different, and that is what we should not be getting into in the government-sponsored news providers. But I think that it's something that political figures need to push back against. And given the state of partisanship in this country now, I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic about that.
And again, at the risk of the moral equivalency fail, I will mention I spent a lot of time embedded on the ground during the war in Iraq. I spent time with the strategic communications cells who thought that information could be like ordnance that you could fire at the Iraqi people and then measure the impact. But these are populations who lived under dictatorships. They can tell an American military propaganda story planted in the local press very easily. So Philip, just to underscore what you said, the government has the right to its communication system, absolutely, but it has to be completely devoted to accuracy and truth. So we are at the 2-minute mark. Edward, without other questions, I'll turn the floor back over to you for the final wrap up, and just a thanks from me for the honor of moderating and commenting, and what a great discussion to everyone. Now, Edward, back to you.
This has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you both for doing this. And I want to encourage everybody to buy Phil's book. I should have a copy here to hold up. Phil, I'm very sorry. I've got it downstairs.
Here it is.
There it is. There we go. No, it's really good. Phil's a very, very good writer, and he's got such a depth of knowledge. I highly recommend it. It couldn't be more timely. And Thom, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. You always bring such a depth of knowledge to all of these issues, and a love for Fletcher and all these subjects. So George Washington is lucky to have you right now, let me tell you. So, and I want to thank everybody here for joining us, please stay in touch on all these issues. So I think with that, we'll say goodbye to all.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Thom.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
This is my research associate.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
See you, Peter. Alan, Casey, talk later.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
everybody.
thanks,
Bye.
Casey.
Bye, everybody. Bye.